Hi everybody, this is Kate with Glazer's Camera here in Seattle. So sorry for the delay in getting live today. It's Devin's fault. No, I'm just kidding. Sometimes the internet doesn't want to let us do the things we want to do, and that's what we were dealing with in troubleshooting. So we apologize for getting this rolling just a little bit late. I know you're super excited to talk about landscape photography and hear this presentation with Aaron. Before we get to that, just super quick, we want to welcome you to 2021, let you know we are open 7 days a week. If you have questions during this session, post those in the comments on YouTube or on the Facebook live feed, and we'll do some questions as we can throughout the session, and then we typically always wrap these little ones up with some Q&A at the end. Today we are going to talk about getting started with landscape photography. We have the awesome Aaron Norberg, who works with Sigma, online today to do a presentation on the topic, sharing his background, his workflow, and all that good stuff. So again, if you have questions during the presentation, just get those posted. We'll do some Q&A throughout, but hold a few of them to the end. Aaron, hi, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you guys?
We are doing good. So just to get you started, I don't want to waste any more time because we are starting a few minutes late. But if you want to share just a little bit about you and what you do with Sigma, maybe that's in your presentation. I can't recall. But let's start with that, and then we can dive right in.
Sounds good. Yeah, my name's Aaron Norberg. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to Glazers for hosting us this evening. I am a technical representative with Sigma, so I do most of the field support for the Northwest region, which typically would mean, in-store events, trainings, helping customers sort through equipment. But right now, it mostly means doing online events like this. So happy to be here. I've been into photography since I was in grade school. I just found a camera kind of around the house and started playing with it and never really looked back. And I do primarily shoot landscape and urban landscape material. So this is a subject that I spend a fair amount of time playing around in. So hopefully, by the time we're done with our little session here, we'll have enough information for anyone who hasn't dabbled in this type of photography before, that you'll feel comfortable jumping in and exploring the areas around us and learning how to better photograph some of those locations that we wander through. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my presentation here. Once we get into the presentation, I'm going to turn my camera off so we can just kind of focus on the material. But like Kate said, if anyone has any questions as we go along, please post them in the chat forums and the comment sections, and those will get relayed back. And we'll try to address whatever we can that comes through as we're going through the material. But like Kate said, we'll also have some time at the end for anything that we didn't cover. So with that said, let's just jump on in. And that should be up there. You guys seen that okay?
We got it. We see it.
Cool. All right, and then we're off. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. This is a quick rundown of what we're going to be going through in the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to start by trying to cover how to best get started in finding new locations, how to time our outings to get the best conditions, what kind of equipment we'll want to take with us, and then we'll get into some of the starting points for exposure settings to capture the scene the way that we see it. And then finally, we'll touch on some thoughts for helping to build stronger images. So with that said, when we start to talk about finding locations for landscape photography, one of the first things that I think we want to consider is what kind of landscape imagery we want to make. Landscape photography is pretty broadly defined as photography showing spaces within the world, typically centered on the presence of nature, but can also focus on man-made features or disturbances of landscapes. And that's a pretty open-ended range of images that could be considered landscape photographs, which of course also means that that's a pretty broad range of locations where landscape photographs could be made. So let's try to narrow in on this a little bit more to make our location scouting more actionable. First, there's what I would consider the more classical interpretation of landscape photography. And in this kind of classical representation, landscape is generally depicted as primitive and pristine, devoid of human impact, and something to be revered and preserved. And these images of stunning natural beauty can serve as a call to remember the simpler pleasures in life, such as finding ourselves surrounded by the wild and rugged terrain and untroubled by the busyness of modern living. But scouting out these grand vistas and natural wonders can be challenging, as they tend to be found in remote areas that may not always offer easy or convenient access. And then there's what I would consider the more contemporary interpretation of landscape photography, wherein the landscape is depicted in a more photojournalistic sense, with less concern for finding or depicting a perfect natural scene and more interest in showing a scene as it was found. And that's not to say that images made in this vein aren't also beautiful depictions of wild places, but rather that elements like harvested trees, power lines, or roadways that might hint at a human impact are included in the image rather than removed. And this also can mean that smaller or more common elements in a scene might also warrant attention alongside the more grandiose elements. And I find that approaching the land from this perspective can open us up to a wider range of subjects and locations, because we don't necessarily need to trek out to a remote wilderness to find ourselves surrounded by nature. Now, in either case, a great place to start our location scouting is the excellent network of state and national parks and forests that we have here in the US. These areas have been largely protected from industrial, commercial, and urban development, and therefore they encompass some of the most primitive lands we have in the country. Now, I've found that the national and state parks generally tend to feature more improvements, such as paved roads, walking paths, visitor centers, rest areas, and established viewpoints and even overnight accommodations. And these amenities can definitely make it easier to identify and explore a new area that you haven't been through before. But I've also found that the more accessible a location tends to be, the more people you tend to find there. So keep that in mind. While it might make it a little bit more difficult to find a unique vantage point from one of these areas, especially if you're trying to avoid any kind of human trace, these can still be great places to start when you're looking for new scenic locations. Now, the state and national forests generally are much broader areas, and by comparison, they tend to be pretty primitive when it comes to improvements. You'll still find lookouts, viewpoints, smaller campgrounds, and maybe even restroom facilities scattered throughout these areas. But you're also a lot more likely to find yourself traveling alone along dirt roads, some of which may or may not be passable without some ground clearance. Wandering through these areas will generally require a little bit more self-direction, but you're also much less likely to find yourself in a crowd trying to shoot from the same vantage point. So for our region, here are a few resources that we can use to try to navigate through these national and state parks and forests. These sites will allow you to search all resources within a region, or to search out specific resources if you're looking for something in particular. Now keep in mind that most of the sites within these networks will have some sort of fee or pass required for access. So once you've found a site that you want to check out, do be sure to take note of that before heading out. Now, once we've got a few areas in mind, if you're able to, I find that the most effective way to explore these areas is by foot. Hiking trails often will cut through any one of these individual networks of state and national parks and forests. And in many cases, these hiking trails can take us to locations that simply can't be reached by a car. And with that in mind, one of my favorite resources when I'm seeking out a new hiking trail or new area to explore is a service called All Trails. They offer free basic access via both the web and through a mobile app, although some content does require upgrading to a paid subscription. But I find that their listings make it pretty easy to browse through the trails in an area that I might want to explore. You can sort options based on difficulty, distance, duration, elevation gains, and a number of other filters to find routes that match your skill level and your time frame. But one of my favorite features of All Trails are the photos that are uploaded by other members who have actually been out on that trail. And these can be super helpful to get a sense of what kind of scenery we can expect to encounter on any given trail or in any general area. This really helps me to gauge whether or not a particular trail is going to have the features that I'm interested in photographing. Now, another method that I often use is to simply pick an area or maybe even just a direction and let myself wander. When I'm out trying to photograph this way, I generally try to avoid driving on the interstate because I find that it's too difficult to really take in much of the terrain when you're moving at 60 plus miles an hour. But a lot of the smaller state highways generally have more moderate speed limits, and they also tend to have less traffic, which makes it easier to both identify and react to the scenery that we're moving through. And here's an example of that kind of method in action. In one instance where I was looking for a new area to explore, I took a quick look at my immediate area on Google Maps, and I identified that the Clatsop Forest here in Northwest Oregon was an area that I hadn't really been through. So moving into that area a little bit closer, I saw that there were a number of state routes that I could explore that went straight to the heart of the area. And I was pretty easily able to plot out a general course that would cover a lot of new ground for me and give me an opportunity to get a feel for this region. Now, this method might seem a little arbitrary, and it definitely can be hit or miss. On this particular outing, I came back with just over 120 images, 8 to 10 of which I was actually pretty happy with. Other outings, I've come back with nothing, but there's always a chance that you're not going to find something that piques your interest. And I've had similar experiences in the national and state parks too. That being said, I have found some of my favorite images simply wandering down a backcountry road. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can combine facets of these different approaches too. I often try to take the slow route when I do head out to a state park or when I'm on my way to a new trailhead, because you just never know what kind of scenery you're going to see traveling to or from what you might have thought was the main destination for the day. Regardless of which direction my initial planning comes from, I often find that the more time I give myself to be out in the elements, the more photos I usually come back with. So once we get ourselves out in the field, what kind of elements should we be looking for? Well, obviously, one of the things that is the easiest to identify would be unique or striking geological features. It's something I'm always keeping an eye out for. This could be something obvious like a rocky peak jutting out from a forested valley, or it could be something more subtle like an unusual split between two adjoining boulders. Another thing that I'm always keeping an eye out for are unique viewpoints, or areas that share a perspective with our viewer that they may not be familiar with. And these don't always have to be at the top of a mountain to be an impactful image. In this instance here, I was halfway across a suspension bridge, standing over a river that had carved itself into a little valley in western Montana's Bitterroot Wilderness. So don't let yourself think that you're only going to find cool vantage points at high altitudes. Another thing that always catches my eye is interesting or unique vegetation, like this lone tree standing just outside the Mosier tunnels. And one other thing I'm always keeping an eye out for would be strong plays of light and shadow, like these dark blots of shadow cast by the trees in Montana's Lolo National Forest. So now that we've got some ideas in mind for locations to explore, let's consider when might be the best time for us to get out and photograph. The first thing to consider is the weather forecast for the day. While a cloudless day might be ideal for getting out and exploring, it might not be the best conditions for taking photographs. Most sensors are going to struggle to contain the full dynamic range of such a contrasty scene. Without anything in the sky to diffuse direct sunlight, the scene is generally going to exhibit very high overall contrast and sharp, pronounced shadows with not much interest in the sky. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, what we tend to deal with more often over here, on an overcast day, you're going to get very soft and very diffuse light. And this tends to result in lower overall contrast and less defined or maybe no shadows at all. Personally, I find that the smoother gradations between highlight and shadow results in files that are much easier to work with in post-production, but a totally overcast day can be just as difficult to activate our composition as a cloudless day. Now, overcast days can still be really useful if you're doing primarily macro work, or if you're photographing from within a forest canopy where you're not going to have a lot of skyline. Now, ideally, we're going to be somewhere in between these two extremes. A sunny day with some scattered cloud cover can give us some diffusion of the sun's direct light, while maintaining some shadow definition and giving us something in the sky. These are definitely my favorite conditions to be out shooting under. And that's not to say that we shouldn't go out shooting on sunny days. The higher contrast of that direct sunlight can really lend itself to a more monochromatic palette. But also, if you get in the habit of snapping a quick picture with your smartphone whenever you're taking a shot with your primary camera, you can usually use the geotag from that smartphone image to find your way back to that area on a day that has softer light too. And sometimes the days that we have time to get out aren't always going to have the best conditions to be shooting in, but we can still make these days count if we think of them as location scouting days. If I find a great location, I can usually earmark it and go back on a day that has better conditions to get a better final image. Now, the time of day also can have a big impact on the look of our images too. Now, as the sun is more or less directly overhead in the middle of the day, our shadows are going to be much more defined and direct, and the contrast in the scene tends to be higher. Cloud cover also tends to dissipate in the heat of the day, which can impact both the content and the tone of our images. Now, as the sun is less direct around dawn and dusk, shooting earlier or later in the day can give us more dramatic, elongated shadows, lower overall contrast, and a warmer palette. And we tend to refer to this time as the golden hour, as the light tends to be flattering for nearly any kind of subject. But timing our shots for sunrise or for sunset can require a little bit more planning and potentially more personal gear to make sure we can get in and out safely and comfortably. So be sure to consider the impact that the season and altitude may have on your outing if you're planning on shooting around sunrise or sunset, especially if it's in a location that you haven't been to before. Another general consideration we want to keep in mind is the likelihood of other people being out at a location that we're wandering through, and the impact that a direct human presence can have on our images. Now, if you want the look of a natural, pristine area devoid of people, then we may have to head out on weekdays, or we may have to get out a little earlier in the day to avoid other people in that area. This also may mean that we have to go a little further out of our way to find quieter areas. All right, so now that we've covered some of the where and when to get started for landscape photography, let's take a look at how. And we're going to start with the equipment side. First and foremost, we want to decide what camera we're going to be taking with us, as this is going to impact a number of our other equipment decisions. Luckily, landscape material generally isn't terribly demanding on the primary equipment compared to some other fields of photography. I find generally my biggest concerns for camera performance in this field would be dynamic range, resolution, and overall size and weight. You can get great results out of full frame, APS-C, and micro four thirds size sensors. And likewise, both DSLRs and mirrorless cameras can be successfully employed here. Larger sensors do tend to have some advantages in dynamic range and high resolution capabilities compared to smaller sensors, but larger sensors also tend to come at the expense of size and weight. Generally, they're going to require bigger, heavier equipment. So generally speaking, I would say start with what you have. Unless your current camera is more than 6 or 8 years old, you're not likely to notice a dramatic improvement from simply upgrading your camera. Now, once we know what camera we're going to be taking along, the next thing we want to consider is our lens options. And as the eye of your imaging system, the lens has a pretty significant impact on the overall look of our photographs. Perhaps the most obvious attribute of the lens in this area is going to be the angle of view, or how much of the scene in front of us is going to be projected onto our camera's sensor. And angle of view is primarily an attribute of the lens's focal length. A 50mm focal length is generally considered to be a normal perspective because a 50mm lens renders a perspective similar to that of human vision. Lenses with focal lengths that are less than 50mm are generally referred to as wide angle because they project more of a scene than what human vision perceives. Lenses with focal lengths greater than 50mm are generally referred to as telephoto. And these lenses will project a more narrow perspective than human vision, which effectively compresses distance between us and our subject. So let's see if we can make some visual sense out of that. These images were made in the Starvation Creek Falls area here in Oregon. And this first shot was taken with a 28mm perspective. And this is a focal length that is usually found in any of the kit lenses that get bundled with a new camera. Now, this next image was taken from the exact same position using a 12mm focal length. So without even moving the camera, you can see how much more of the scene we're able to see with that difference between 28mm and 12mm. It can be pretty significant. Now, on the other side of that, this image from the gorge was taken at 16mm. And this is a perspective that's usually covered by the more popular wide-angle zoom options. Now, from the same perspective, or from the same position, changing our lens to a much longer focal length of 100mm, we can see what impact focal length can have on the look of our images. As focal lengths decrease, you'll be able to capture more of the scene in front of you, but the individual elements of the scene are going to end up being smaller in our images. On the other side of that, as focal lengths increase, we're going to see less of the scene in front of us, but the small or distant elements in that scene will be larger in our image. So with that in mind, here's what I generally recommend as a starting point. For full frame cameras, anything between 14 and 50 millimeters, some sort of coverage in that range, you'll be able to get started. For APS-C cameras, that works out to be somewhere between 10 and 35 millimeters. And on a micro four thirds camera, that would be anywhere between 7 and 25 millimeters. Now, similar to what we discussed with camera bodies, you can usually just start with what you've already got. Most kit lenses are going to cover a 24 or a 28 millimeter perspective on the wide side, which is definitely usable in many situations. And the longer ends of these lenses can be really handy if we want to frame up an individual element within the scene rather than the entire scene itself. Now, as you start getting out more and using your equipment more, if you find that you're not able to get enough of the scene in front of you in a single image, that can be a good indication that an ultra wide angle lens might be a good next lens purchase for you. Now, if you're happy with your compositions, but your images are looking soft or flat, that's a good indication that you might be ready for a higher performing standard range lens. As you're starting out, I would generally recommend sticking with zoom lenses for this type of photography, as they'll give you more versatility in being able to cover multiple perspectives. And the slower maximum aperture of a zoom lens typically isn't going to have a negative impact on our exposure settings here. Now, as you get out more and more, you may find use for lenses beyond the standard and ultra wide ranges too, that are most commonly used in landscape. On this outing, for example, as I was out in the Forest Grove State Forest, I was photographing these charred tree stumps, and I noticed on the right-hand edge of the frame, there was a ridge line off in the distance that caught my attention. But because I was shooting with an ultra wide focal length, that ridge line was too small to really make out in this image. So by switching to a longer focal length lens, I was able to compress the distance between myself and that ridge line enough that I could make out some of the details of the clear cut that had caught my eye. And telephoto lenses can be a great complement to a standard or wide angle lens when you want to close in on a specific element of your scene, rather than capture as much of the scene as possible. Now, another instance that might call for a lens outside of the normal options would be when you want to capture close-up details. In this instance, when I was out shooting near Molten Falls in Southwest Washington, these little icicles that had formed on the rocks lining the trail caught my eye as I walked by, but again, with my wide-angle lens, they were really too small to make out. Luckily, I have a lot of lenses at my disposal, and switching to a macro lens, I was able to get in close and really fill the frame with these really small details. Now, only dedicated macro lens will be able to get this close, but if you just want to play around with getting a little bit closer, you may find that your telephoto lens would be able to give you pretty decent magnification. It's not a bad place to start. Okay, so now that we've got some equipment sorted out, let's look at some of our accessories that we might want to have with us. The first thing I'd think about outside of the camera and lens choice would be how I'm going to carry this equipment out into the field. And for this type of outing, I almost always go with a backpack. Even if I'm planning on primarily shooting from the car, I inevitably end up wandering it through enough locations that it's just easier for me to keep my gear on me rather than having to run back to the car for the other lens or my tripod or filter, etc. If I'm hiking through a location though, my choice of which backpack becomes a little bit more important. Because nearly all photo backpacks will give you a fair amount of space to hold that gear, but many of them are not well suited to distributing that weight over a long period of time. So if you're going to be out on foot for more than an hour or two, a bag that was designed for more active use will be well worth the investment. Photo bag manufacturers like F-Stop, Mindshift, and Shimoda have a number of offerings that are built more like a traditional hiking pack, with integrated frames, broader and more adjustable shoulder straps, and a waist strap to help better distribute the load of that equipment. Now that we've got the main gear out of the way, let's look at a few of the accessories we might want to have with us. First on the list would be a tripod, and you don't strictly need a tripod for a lot of landscape work, and you can definitely get away without one if you're totally against using them. But if you want to be able to do any longer duration exposures to soften up moving water or clouds, or if you think you're going to be doing much macro work, you definitely are going to want to have a tripod. Even in good light, I find that I'm often going through the process of using a tripod because it slows me down and it makes it easier for me to focus on the finer details of how I'm composing my scene and what settings I'm using to implement to capture it. I almost always take a tripod with me on these outings, even if I don't end up using it. Another accessory we want to consider is our consumables. Now, unless you're shooting video, you probably don't need to go crazy here. We just want to make sure that we have enough power and memory to get through the day without having to head home early. If you have a mid-level or a pro-level DSLR that has a bigger battery pack, you may not need a spare for a single day outing, but if you're shooting with an entry-level DSLR that has a smaller battery, or if you're shooting with basically any mirrorless camera, it's not a bad idea to have a spare. And memory cards have definitely come down in price over the recent years, so as long as we have one or two 32 or 64 gig cards, we should be fine. Now, you may also find a few filters can come in really handy when we're out shooting landscape. Most digital cameras already have a UV filter in place over the sensor, so we generally don't need to worry about a UV filter for cutting through atmospheric haze like we used to do with film. But polarizing filters can be super handy. Polarizing filters will cut out reflected light from our scene, which will give us better saturation from foliage, from water, and even from the sky. Now, as they do reduce the total amount of light transmitted through the lens, a polarizing filter will require a little bit more exposure. But because it's in front of the lens, your camera's meter will recognize this and adjust accordingly. The only real caveat to remember with polarizing filters is that when you're using lenses wider than around 28 millimeters, if you're shooting an image that has the sky in it, you'll be taking in such a wide expanse of the sky that light usually is not going to be evenly polarized from edge to edge. And you can get uneven exposure that's really difficult to correct in post-production. So keep an eye on that. The other type of filter you may find a use for here would be a neutral density filter. And these filters reduce the amount of light transmitted to the lens to varying degrees. A solid neutral density filter affects the entire scene. And these can be really helpful if we just want to drag out our exposure. So if we wanted to blur the motion of running water or moving clouds, these can be really handy. But there are also graduated neutral density filters, which will transition gradually from full strength density to zero density. And these can be really helpful in trying to balance out the differing light levels between the sky and the foreground, which can allow us to retain more information and detail in a single capture. Polarizing and solid ND filters are usually available in common threaded configurations, but graduated neutral density filters are typically going to be either square or rectangular, and those will generally require an accessory filter holder. So that can be a little bit of an expense to get started on if you don't have one already. But the nice thing about the accessory filter holders is that they can then be used on just about any of your lenses. And then lastly, we want to consider our own safety and comfort on these outings too. Keep in mind that the air temperatures are typically going to be cooler around sunrise and sunset than what we're used to in the middle of the day. And this is particularly true at higher elevations. Also, once we get out into wilderness areas, weather conditions can turn really quickly. And with that in mind, I generally bring along a weather-resistant outer layer in any season. And I'll also bring some warmer insulating layers when I'm heading out during spring, fall, or winter. It's also almost always a good idea to bring water and something to snack on too. And if you're just starting out with hiking, be sure to have a map with you that isn't dependent on cellular reception, because a lot of these areas you might not get any signal at all. And if you're going solo, make sure someone knows where you're heading and when you should be back. Generally speaking, I try to make sure I have anything I think I might need for the day with me. So if something ends up being unexpectedly closed, or if my plans change throughout the day, I can still get out and get back safely. If you are planning on making use of facilities or resources while you're out in the field, especially right now, it's not a bad idea to double check that they're going to be open and accessible while you're out there. All right, now that we've got the gear covered, let's jump in for a moment on the nuts and bolts of how to make sure that our camera settings are capturing the scene the way that we're seeing it. So first of all, we've got 3 attributes that we can influence to arrive at a correct exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO speed. And each of these attributes also has an impact on the aesthetics of the images that we make. When I'm thinking about how to expose the scene in front of me for landscape photography, I try to think about what is the most important attribute for this scene. And in landscape, it generally tends to be controlling how much of my scene is in focus, or my depth of field. And since aperture is the setting that most directly affects how much of my scene is in focus, this generally becomes my primary consideration for my exposure parameters. With that in mind, aperture priority could be a good choice for an exposure mode. Unless I'm on a tripod though, I still want to make sure that my shutter speed is fast enough to freeze any motion that I might be making by hand holding my equipment. So often I'll run in manual exposure mode so that I can dictate my aperture to make sure I get the depth of field that I want for that photo. And I can set a shutter speed that's fast enough to make sure I'm not going to have any motion blur in the image. Turning on auto ISO while running in manual will let the camera compensate for changing light conditions without you having to manually adjust each exposure for each new scene. And if I find that the camera's exposure program is consistently over or underexposing, that's when I'll use exposure compensation to deal with that. Now, if you don't want to bother with setting both aperture and shutter speed, you can run an aperture priority instead. You just want to check occasionally to make sure that you're not getting any motion blur in your images. And when we're shooting handheld, the general rule of thumb is to keep our shutter speed the fractional equivalent of our effective focal length or faster. So let's look at this image, for example. This was made with a 56mm, which is an APS-C coverage lens. So it has an effective focal length of approximately 85mm. So in this instance, we'd want to make sure that we're shooting at 1/85th of a second or faster. Now, personally, I found that as sensor resolution has increased, I need to be a little bit more conservative with this guideline than what I may be used to. So for cameras that are 18 megapixels and above, I generally would keep my shutter speed at 1/160th of a second or faster with this kind of focal length. Now, luckily on this particular outing, I had plenty of light to work with, and keeping my shutter speed high and my ISO low was no trouble. Now, once we have our aperture and shutter speeds figured out, ISO is the last parameter that we can modulate to affect exposure. Generally speaking, as ISO speeds increase, you can get proper exposure with lower light levels, but we're also going to be sacrificing dynamic range and we'll be incurring higher noise levels. So with that in mind, we want to try to keep our ISO as low as possible. But unless you have a camera that's more than 6 or 8 years old, you shouldn't have to worry too much about using a higher ISO if needed. And this is another instance where having a tripod can really help, because that'll allow us to use longer duration exposures to keep our ISO value lower. Whichever exposure program you end up using, be sure to keep an eye on how your highlights in the scene are being recorded. Many camera exposure programs tend to prioritize shadow exposure, which can lead to blown out highlights. And when we lose information in the highlight regions, it tends to be both more obvious in the image and harder to recover in post-processing than when we lose information in the shadow regions. A quick peek at your histogram should tell you whether or not you have what you need before you move on to the next scene. Also, enabling the highlight exposure warning in your camera's review menu can be a lifesaver here. All right, so with that, we should have enough information to get started out in the field. We'll get our exposure sorted out by figuring out what aperture we want to use for the depth of field that we're after. Usually this, for me, ends up being somewhere between f4 and f8, depending on the sensor format. And then we'll make sure that our shutter speed is either fast enough to freeze our own motion if we're shooting handheld, or we can set a slower duration if we're trying to blur the motion of water or clouds in our scene. And then lastly, we'll modify our ISO until our histogram looks good. Now, I also generally recommend trying to set your white balance manually to the daylight setting or cloudy setting if it's a cloudy overcast day. And by doing this, you'll find that your images are going to be more consistent from that day. Because when you have the camera set to auto white balance, it's going to try to measure the color temperature of the scene individually for each image that you take. And that means if you're trying to compile images from that outing, each one of those is going to require its own color correction. If you manually set your white balance at the beginning of your outing, unless the lighting conditions change dramatically, you shouldn't have much variation from all the photos that you took that day, so they should look more consistent. And then I also recommend shooting in a RAW format here. There are some benefits to shooting in a JPEG format, but they are primarily size benefits. And as inexpensive as memory cards and hard drives have become now, I'd much rather have the larger file that gives me more room for post-production than having a smaller JPEG to save on space. All right, and with that said, let's jump in on a couple quick tips to help us improve the impact of our images. So one of the first things that I consider when I'm framing up a new scene is what kind of difference can the layout of the frame have on this image? Now, horizontal framing tends to be used most commonly in landscape photography and is definitely generally considered the standard or normal orientation. But try to look at and analyze the elements in your scene. Are they predominantly horizontal or predominantly vertical? In this image, the horizontal layout tends to emphasize the horizontal run of the foothill in the background. It also means that there's a few more trees in the foreground to the left of us here. Now, framing the same scene vertically shifts the emphasis away from the hill in the background and towards the vertical rise of the trees in the foreground. It also allowed me to crop out some of those extra trees off to the side in the foreground. And narrowing down the foreground to just these 3 trees helps to create the repetition with the groves of trees in the midground here. So try experimenting with this a little. Once you've framed up the shot the way you like it, try flipping the camera 90 degrees and see if you can make another shot out of it. If nothing else, this will give you a few more options to choose from when you get back home. Let's also consider some of the elements of design and how we might apply them to our imaging frame when we're out shooting landscape. When I'm out photographing, value is one of the key elements that I'm always looking for. And here, value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of an object in our scene. And it can be an incredibly powerful tool in any type of photography. The contrast in value between different elements within our scene can help to add visual interest to what otherwise might be a relatively static environment. And therefore, that helps to add visual interest to our images. And we can also play with the contrast in values, or we can use a homogeny of values to create more striking images. And images like this one that are dominated by brighter tones are referred to as high-key images. Images dominated by darker tones are considered low-key images. Value is an element that can add a lot of impact to our images. And training our eyes to recognize and respond to the play of light and shadow can help us to make stronger images in just about any kind of situation. And especially if we're trying to get into deviating from a standard exposure, shooting high key or low key, knowing how to read our histogram and modify our exposure to put these values where we want them in our image can be essential to successfully capturing value the way that we see it. Because if we leave our camera to its own devices, it's going to try to average out these dark and bright tones, and it's going to have a very different look. In addition to value, color in photography can be an incredibly powerful tool. And color here refers to the hue and the saturation of the objects in our scene. The placement of similar colors, like what we see here, can be used to create visual harmony between otherwise dissimilar objects in our scene, while the use of contrasting colors can also be used to create a focal point and to draw attention to a specific element within our composition. Color is another one of those elements that can add a lot of interest and impact to just about any kind of image. So learning to see and respond to color can go a long way to making more memorable images. Now, there are a number of other elements we can utilize in addition to color and value. Now, lines are one such element that we can use to lead our viewers' eyes through a composition. And these could be implemented directly with more obvious elements like this fence line here, or a trail or a roadway, maybe power lines. Or these could be more suggested lines, like with the tree here, or a ridge line, or a waterway. Shape is another element that can be used to add visual interest to our compositions. And in this image, the similarity of the arrow shape made by the coniferous tree in the midground and the inverted arrow shapes made by the deciduous trees in the foreground help to add both harmony and contrast to this scene. And likewise, it helps to add visual interest to our composition. Or in this image here, where the small semicircular shapes of these cutouts in this fence line play against the wide, flat expanse of the hillside across the river. Size or scale is another element that we can consider. It can be used to denote hierarchy, to create unity, or to create contrast. Here, the similarity in the shape between the mound in the foreground and the foothills in the background helps to create a sense of harmony between these elements, while the difference in size helps to create some visual contrast or tension between them. And the balance of these two helps to build visual interest in this composition. Another thing we can play with is the balance of positive and negative space to create either a static or a dynamic composition. In this image, the negative space, or the relatively sparse field below and the sky above, is punctuated by the positive space created by the cluster of trees near the middle of the frame. And the balance between activated and empty spaces helps us to create visual tension and to direct our attention to these trees here in the midground. And texture is another element that we can use to add visual interest to our compositions. The contrast in texture between the grass in the foreground, the water in the midground, and the rock face and trees in the background helps to build variety and build interest in the frame. And the more that we can recognize these elements at play in the scenes before us, the more deliberate we can be in trying to use them to build interest and variety in our compositions. Perhaps the most important part of this whole exercise is to start thinking more critically about what we're responding to within a scene and whether or not we're capturing that element or elements as effectively as we can. So here's my first take from a scene that I found wandering out through the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington. I liked the contrast between the horizontal lines of the cleared hillside and the vertical lines of the few remaining trees, but with my ultra-wide zoom, the 12 to 24, these elements were really too small to really activate my composition. So moving up along this hillside, I got a little bit closer until those remaining groves of trees were large enough to really have an impact in my composition. At this point though, I still felt like the foreground needed something to activate it beyond just these tree limbs that were left behind. So by taking a minute to look at that and recognize what was and wasn't working, I was able to shuffle around and move a little bit closer and a little bit further to the left to combine the terrain running down and to the right, the closer tree stump on the left, the more distant tree stumps off to the right, and then the trees that are left in the center and then off to the right of the frame. When you find something that catches your eye, don't stop after you take that first photo. Try taking a minute to consider what about that scene caught your eye in the first place and see if you can't find another way to photograph it. The more that we start to analyze these components that we're working with and try playing around with them and composing them differently, the more we're going to be able to find compositions that better represent what caused us to stop and take that photo in the first place. So now that we've got some of the basics covered, how do we continue to progress? Well, first and foremost, we have to spend the time. Like anything else, this gets easier with repetition. The more that you go out and you review your work and see what did and didn't work, the more it will start to click what decisions you made in the field that led to those better photographs. And then you'll be able to apply those decisions on your next outing and hopefully come back with more stronger images. So we also want to take that time to review our own work. And I generally try to do this as close to that outing as possible so that the memory of being there is still fresh. But beyond looking at our own work, I try to recommend or encourage people to get other people to look at your work as much as possible, because other people will always see things in our work that we may not see ourselves. But first and foremost, make sure that you enjoy yourself. And that is all we've got for the material. Do we have any questions that we didn't get covered?
We have had a couple, but I've been answering them in the chat because there are things that I actually know the answers to. But I think it could be interesting for you to maybe, you talked about histograms maybe a little bit, maybe just kind of covering that. Someone was asking about how you read the histogram, and I kind of mentioned that it can be a little bit subjective, but it's definitely a great tool because, you know, some people will be like, shoot to the right and shoot to the left and do this and do that. And so I just kind of like high level explain, it helps you really see if your highlights are blown out, pure white, or if the shadows are just too dark. And to me, I feel like the histogram can be super, super helpful if you are shooting JPEG only, since you won't have as much leeway with those files to fix problems. But I don't worry about viewing the histogram as much if I'm shooting RAW, to be perfectly honest. But maybe share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually have, let me see if I can bring this up real quick. I have a visual from another course that might help with that. Okay, so this is one that's pulled from a presentation that we give on night sky photography. So it's kind of biased towards the other side of the spectrum than what we typically would see shooting landscape. But what we have here is it's basically a readout of, let me see if I can start, of where all the values in our scene are falling between absolute black on the left and absolute white on the right. So the histogram that we see on the screen right now is pretty typical of what you'd expect for an average daylight exposure. We have all those spikes of information falling neatly in between the two outside edges of the histogram. And what that means at a quick glance, we're not losing any information to either shadows or highlights. That means we should have plenty of information in that file to work with, and we can push our exposure up or down as we need to in post-production. Now, again, this is kind of biased the other direction, but
right. But you can also
what
creatively
try to avoid is those spikes of information running right off the edge on either direction of our histogram. Because when there's no separation between those spikes of information and the outside edges of the histogram, that means that our sensor is losing information in that scene. And when it runs off to the left, like what we see here for nighttime photography, that means that we're losing information in the shadow regions. If it were to bunch up on the right-hand side of the histogram, that would mean that we're losing information in the highlight regions. And in either case, especially like you said, if you're shooting JPEG and you don't have as much information to push around in post-production, that can be really critical. But this is especially if you have the highlight exposure warning turned on. This is something that you can just take a quick glance at and see, do I have everything, more or less where I need it to be, or am I under or overexposing to the point that I'm losing information? And if I see something like that, I'm going to want to moderate my exposure so that there's some distinction between where those spikes end and the outside edges of the histogram.
Well, and then I was just going to add that creatively, sometimes it's okay if those shadows are a little bit more dark or the highlights are too overexposed because maybe the other elements in the frame are more important. But that's definitely where we think about creatively what do we want to do, and then also that conversation of RAW versus JPEG, having a RAW file, especially when you're doing things like landscape photography, honestly, having those RAW files comes in so handy because if you're going to a place that maybe you can't get back to with any ease, like I shot a bunch of stuff in Iceland, so everything I shot while I was in Iceland, because it's the only time I've been able to get there, was shot in RAW, because I knew that if I did kind of flub something here or there, that okay, I can fix it in post, it'll be okay, Yeah. So all right, let's talk about lenses. So someone is asking, for someone who's starting out, what zoom lens would you recommend for this genre if they wanted to avoid the kit lens? So, and you probably talked about this a little bit, but what for someone starting out, what would your go-to, if you could only get a zoom lens, be?
There's always a little bit of personal preference in those, but I think very broadly speaking, something like a 24 to 105 or 24 to 70, somewhere in that range for a full frame camera, or something like 17 to 70 for an APS-C size camera. Okay. That'll give you a little bit of kind of most of the range that you might find yourself using, especially if you don't know that you really want to shoot as wide as possible or you want to shoot tight. Those general purpose focal length lenses are really popular for really good reason. They cover a lot of really useful ground. 24, 28, even shooting between 24 and 35 in a lot of instances is going to be plenty wide for many locations. They may not get the entire scene, but you'll be able to capture enough of the scene to convey the sense of being there.
Right.
And having like 50 millimeters or 70 or maybe 100 millimeters can be a really effective counterpoint to that wider angle shot. It allows you to show kind of where you are and then to close in on details within that scene. And that can really help to build a compelling body of images rather than just all wide or all tight shots.
Right. Well, and I tend to personally, I spent several years traveling with just a camera bag and a suitcase, and my lenses were a 50 equivalent and an 85 equivalent because I shoot on a crop sensor mirrorless camera. And I was just really floored by like being in all these places, Iceland to Scotland to Thailand, and my 35, which is a 50 equivalent, became the go-to. And I was shooting gorgeous landscapes to doing street photography just with that one lens. So, but I'm also like a person, I love prime lenses. I tend to travel super, super lean and light when it comes to gear. And so that's just like a different perspective or thought on what to take out with you. And the other thing too is like, for those of you tuning in, if you are, not sure what lens to try yet. Places like Glazer's have rental departments where you could rent a lens for a weekend or a week or however long you wanted to try it out for, just to test it out and see if it's going to work for you and how you create images. We are different. We have different ways of seeing. There's different focal lengths that we all like, and that is a great way to think about like trying something new. So, and then one person's asking, do you prefer Sony or Canon? I know you shoot a lot on the Sony cameras. I mean, I think that's also going to be a personal preference thing because all the camera companies are making really amazing cameras. So I think when it comes to picking your camera, think about what fits in your hand best, what menu system you enjoy the best, what image quality you enjoy the best, and look and feel. And all of that good stuff. Do you have any
especially for this type of photography where we're shooting in daylight, we're usually not going to be pushing the parameters of absolute performance from a camera sensor. I would say, any camera at this point, any contemporary camera in recent years, is going to be more than adequate to get a good exposure with good resolution, good dynamic range.
Absolutely.
Especially if we're keeping an eye on how we're exposing that sensor. I find that the lens, I'm probably a little biased here too, but the lens really can make a much bigger impact in immediate image quality versus a body that's maybe 3 or 4 years difference between what you have and what's current. Because a lot of those performance differences are going to be like low light performance or fast action performance, which we're not really going to be using here.
Well, and definitely the lens makes an impact because, a lens that's $100 or $200 versus a lens that's $2,000 is going to produce vastly different image results. So, if you started out with your kit lens and you're ready for something sharper that lets in more light and all those good things, then you're going to make a bigger investment in that too. So, we're going to wrap this up. It's just about 6 o'clock here. Aaron, did you have any closing comments? I have one thing to share with folks before we sign off.
Just want to thank you again for joining us tonight. I do want to mention we've got a couple more classes coming up, and the next one is actually one that's a little bit different than just this online-only format that we've been kind of doing.
And that's what I was going to talk about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to let people know, and I'm going to post the link so you can go and sign up. We're doing, we're trying some different things this year. We actually did this once. Aaron and I collaborated on it in a way, and then we created a 2-part series on this very topic, where it led off with a presentation, and then we had kind of some photo prompts, and then we got together a week later or so and did a photo critique and discussion, and added in the opportunity for people who registered to be able to borrow some Sigma gear for a limited amount of time. We're doing a variation on that next month. It starts in just a few weeks, and it's on macro photography. So if any of you guys are tuning in are interested in that genre, there's a small fee, but that fee really kind of helps cover our time, the extended format, as well as gives you access to basically rent a Sigma lens for free for a week. which is pretty phenomenal. And the fee on that event is $25, and part one will be a presentation with someone else who works with Sigma on the topic of macro photography, tips on working in this genre, as well as some photo prompts and kind of like an assignment, for lack of a better word. And then we'll get together 1 week later, where those who are registered share their images that created on those lenses, or maybe other images that they want to share, and we'll do basically a photo review and critique. And so it's going to be a small group. It's intended to be a small group, so everyone has the opportunity to share their work and have some meaningful discussion around their work. So check that out. If you just go to glazerscamera.com/workshops, you can see the whole lineup of everything else coming up, including that one special session. And there's just a few spots left. So if you're interested in it, go get your ticket today. Let's see, we've got some thank yous coming in from Will and Sarah, especially for the tips on being prepared in the outdoors. So thank you for that, Erin. I know you're also a big hiker, and getting out and doing these things are super helpful. Did you have anything you wanted to tag on to that like really long-winded description about that upcoming event?
No, I think you pretty much got what I was going to say. We'll be kind of giving people an introduction into some of the considerations for shooting small objects, shooting macro, if you haven't done it already. And then we will have an opportunity for people in the area to come into the store and pick up a Sigma lens to try and apply some of the information that we cover in that presentation to their actual image making. And then we'll come back the following week and we'll review images made after that class.
Yeah.
So it can be a really effective way to hopefully learn something new, but then have a chance to apply it while it's still fresh, and a chance to try out a lens that you may not already have access to.
Right. And also give you that important feedback on the work that you're creating. And sometimes with a lot of these live sessions, we don't have the opportunity to do that. So we're kind of mixing things up. We're going to try this in a few different ways throughout the year, and we're also coming up with some other ideas to get you guys more involved in these live sessions as we go forward. So with all that said, I want to thank everybody who tuned in today, and thank you so much, Erin, for all the great information and sharing your work and all this technique with folks. So we appreciate your time as always. And for those of you watching, check out our website for more upcoming programming. We have a couple of events this weekend with Canon. One is on printing, so if you're into printing, especially with the new Pro 300, you might want to check that out. And much, much more happening. Well, we're constantly adding more to the website, so just keep an eye on it, get on our mailing list, and you'll get updates on that too. So thank you all. Everybody have a great evening, and that's all I got. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.